Thanks for coming along tonight on this cold Sydney evening, where Chris Wallace makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. She's well known to many of you. I will introduce her briefly. A political historian, Dr. Wallace is Professor at the Faculty of Business, Government and Law at the University of Canberra. Her previous book, How to Win an Election, drew important lessons for Labor from the shock at the 2019 election. And I think you're the reason Labor won. I think apparently a lot of Labor guys read this book, How to Win an Election. And she was formerly a long-standing member of the Canberra Press Gallery, and she's written books on Donald Bradman, on Germaine Greer and John Hewson and some others I've missed, I think. But also she's been a journalist. But tonight she's here in her capacity as the author of the recently released Political Lives, Australian Prime Ministers and Their Biographers, and talking tonight on that very topic. Chris, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerard. Such an old pro, isn't he? How many times have you done that in this room, Gerard? How many hundreds of thousands of people have been exposed to Gerard and Anne Henderson, public intellectuals? It's quite a marathon you two have been running. Someone ought to do something about that sometime. Hint, hint. Anyone out there who's interested in organising a good barbie for them or something? It's a delight to be again at the Sydney Institute with old friends, Gerard and Anne Henderson. Now, Hendo, as he was known back in the Parliament House days, of course, being a man has completely forgotten this, but it's actually our 40th anniversary this year of meeting in the hallowed corridors of Old Parliament House, which was then the current and super happening Parliament House. Gerard at that time was a young whippersnapper. He'd written this incredible journal article in this thing called Quadrant. It was called the Industrial Relations Club. Who remembers it? He was this kind of mysterious, kind of spooky, powerful figure because he'd written this journal article which had shaken up the way people thought about the industrial relations system. Some people thought for good, some people thought for ill. But, you know, being a working class kid from the boonies, I was fascinated by people who thought and wrote and tried to do things in the world. And the fact that someone could write something in a fairly small circulation journal and have such a national impact in terms of pivoting thinking, and even amongst those hostile to Gerard's article, you know, raising questions that needed to be thought about. This was a really big deal. But I've got to say, folks, Gerard wasn't the easiest person to know. He was then, it was 1983, see, plus 40, 2023, Gerard. And he was the Chief of Staff to the then Shadow Treasurer, John Howard. And a typical Gerard Henderson encounter in Parliament House in 1983 went like this. You'd be walking up the corridor, coming the other way, would be this very intense fellow, ostensibly looking relaxed, but not at all relaxed, with a black squash ball bouncing it off the wall as he went along. Now, folks, that's different. You know, in Parliament House, there are a lot of many and varied people, but this was unusual. Then he'd open his mouth and he'd say something like, "Chris, thanks for dropping in." And you think, what? He was a very discombobulating but fascinating person who, in that great way he has of getting people slightly off balance, just sticks a little hook in your head and you think, I've just got to talk to this guy. He's different. And you won't always agree with him. God knows, you know, our Venn diagrams probably don't overlap all that much these days in terms of politics. But you're a very boring person if you only know people who 100% agree with you. You're never going to learn anything. You're never going to contribute a lot. It's so important to me to keep engaging not only with people from the past and keeping them somehow in the current, whatever happens, but also to keep talking. And then, of course, through Gerard, I met Anne. And back at that time, I've got to say, honestly, Anne, I would not have predicted, and few people would have predicted, because we did not stop and think carefully about this, that you would end up authoring more books than Gerard. You've been a phenomenal double, and I'm very pleased to have known you for 40 years, Gerard and Anne. Yeah, here's a little clap for them. But wait, folks, there's more.
Thank you, God.
Yes, otherwise it'd be a short Zoom call. Yeah, I moved to the Press Gallery, Canberra Press Gallery in 1987 and joined the then Melbourne Herald. Rupert Murdoch had just been given the okay by the then Labor government to take over the Herald and Weekly Times group, and Murdoch had kind of plucked out of the Fairfax organisation the wunderkind Fairfax editor Eric Beecher and put him in charge of the whole of the Herald and Weekly Times group, and personally also made him the editor of Rupert's dad's old paper, the Melbourne Herald, and given him carte blanche. Told Eric, you've got 2 years to turn this joint around commercially, otherwise I'm folding it into the Herald Sun. So you know how that story ended, folks. But it was an incredible 2 years, and Eric Beecher hired a lot of fascinating people. The first thing he did was move along the then political correspondent for the Melbourne Herald and replaced him with Kate Legg, who you'll all know from reading The Australian for decades. She's no longer there, but only recently left. And she was a kind of leather-jacketed, mini-skirted, hot newsbreaker extraordinaire, and she then got to choose her bureau, and she hired me, with Eric's okay, to be the Melbourne Herald's economics writer. And I remember when I was broadening out a bit and beginning to write features, one of the first profiles I wrote was of this crazy guy, Gerard Henderson, right? I think it was possibly the first newspaper metropolitan broadsheet, was it then a broadsheet, profile written of you, Gerard. And he actually said to me, you know, Chris, you might have a bit of a knack for this sort of thing, which probably means I was too kind to you. But anyway, it worked out pretty well, because I then indeed went on to become a biographer, and this book I'm going to talk about tonight eventually is partly the product of that. Although from different perspectives, the thing that Gerard, Anne and I have in intense common is a deep conviction about the importance of political history. Political history is pretty unfashionable in the academy these days within history, and which has kind of taken its own turn away from political history, particularly leadership-related biography. That aspect of history is really neglected in mainstream history departments. Now when you get it, it's typically a very marginalised political scientist who's managed to find a spot to write that kind of thing from, or interestingly in business schools where people have a bit more leeway. But I think, you know, if you look at what Anne's written in recent years on Joe Lyons, Enid Lyons, Robert Menzies, and, you know, people like Patrick McMahon Glynn, Mary McKillop, I mean, you've ranged quite widely in your interests. And as I said, written the arse off Gerard. I mean, well done on beating him on the number of books published. Well done, Anne. It's true. It's very unexpected and wonderful. And one of the things about Gerard's writing career before Anne aced him is that his PhD thesis was published by Hale and Ironmonger in 1983 under the title Mr. Santamaria and the Bishops. And I remember reading it on a very slow train between Canberra and Sydney. And I thought, wow, PhD thesis, interesting. So here we are, folks. Disclosure, I don't actually put it in the non-existing acknowledgements of the books, but this is actually the book of my PhD thesis. So following in your footsteps there, comrade. Yes, political lives, wow. This book has been some time coming, and for those of you who have ever had contact with the academy in the form of trying to do a PhD, it's an incredible, I'm not going to use the word journey, it's so hackneyed. It's an incredible period of your life. There are many PhD students who come into a department with a plan, execute the plan, and pop out the other end neatly called doctor, and have learnt, have evolved, have developed very minimally, if at all. They just get a publication out of it. To me, the great kind of exciting PhD student is the one that comes in with a plan, is open to being very challenged, to understanding that there's so much more to understand, to know, that gets cracked open by the process and is prepared to follow a new path rather than execute the plan they came in with. You can see the two groups, it's quite clear. It is so much harder to be that second type of PhD student, but I would argue it just yields so much more richness and depth in terms of not only their development but in their output. So I rocked up to the ANU School of History to do my PhD in history as a mid-career kind of person. My first career was as a political journalist. I worked in the Canberra Press Gallery from 97 onwards in a range of capacities across different media. Probably my favourite gig was as economics writer and then columnist at the AFR. Shouldn't have ever left that job, crackers. Still read the AFR first thing every morning, just love it. But I went along to the part of Australia's historical establishment where the Australian Dictionary of Biography is produced. It has a very esteemed history. It's the largest and longest running exercise in collaborative scholarship in Australian history, in Australia, full stop. It's a magnificent project, still ongoing despite an attempt early on this century to kill it off. It's really a big deal, and its current editor is Professor Melanie Nolan, who became my PhD editor, and PhD supervisor, I should say. I set out to look at Julia Gillard's prime ministership. Dear readers, I'm here to tell you, I failed. I failed for very specific historical reasons, and I had to reformulate my topic. And that story is in the preface of this book. I think it's well known that I set out to write a biography of Julia Gillard. I spiked it. I returned the advance. This was a very radical thing to do. And from the ashes of that project came the thesis for this book. And I'll explain that briefly now. When I began the Julia Gillard biography, she was Australia's Deputy Prime Minister. She was a formidable performer in Parliament, extremely popular, and that became an ever-intensifying thing as Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's prime ministership declined. It's well known that he went to the Copenhagen Climate Summit at the end of 2009 thinking he could magically bring world leaders together and set up a great climate deal for the world. He declared climate change the great moral challenge of our time and was intensely focused on achieving that outcome. He got to Copenhagen and found that world leaders weren't all that interested in doing an amazing climate deal. This was a big shock for Kevin Rudd, formerly a professional diplomat, who really thought he could deliver it. Most people would say, even back then, an unrealistic aspiration. Though, Australia every so often pulls off something remarkable in the diplomatic field, has unexpected successes. So, perhaps he wasn't totally unrealistic in that aspiration. But he failed. He came back to Australia and, according to the accounts of those closest to him, was effectively paralysed from that point on, in shock at being unable to deliver the deal he'd so hoped to achieve there. As he kind of just spun his wheels, many in the Labor Party were saying, for God's sake, Kevin, have an election now, do it on climate policy, we'll win it. He didn't. He remained paralysed. And in that first half of 2010, as Rudd remained inert, in shock, Labor's polling just sank like this. People forget these important contextual details. Everything conflates as we look back. Everyone signed up for the Julia Gillard as a terrible and wicked assassin, a Lady Macbeth of Australian politics. Folks, whatever you think about Julia Gillard, I'm here to tell you factually, she was pretty innocent, relatively innocent in that whole episode. For this reason, Labor tribal elders at the time actually wanted Kevin Rudd to lead Labor to one more federal election. They thought he could win another election. They did not want to get rid of him at that time. But what happened was, as the polling sank, backbenchers got nervous. They got nervous that, an election had to be held that year. Were they going to lose their seat? They started to get rebellious, get antsy. And of course, Bill Shorten, never one to miss out on a leadership struggle, got involved. And from that moment on, it was on. Now, history does not remember, except that I've recorded it now in this preface, that Julia Gillard was one of the group of Labor elders at that time who did not want Kevin to not be Prime Minister anymore. It was not timing of her choosing. Once Bill Shorten got involved and things amped up, she had really little choice. What was she going to do? Say, no, I don't want it? There was, frankly, no viable alternative at that time. So the Rudd Prime Ministership really, far from the blood dripping from a dagger at her hip kind of character, the Rudd Prime Ministership was essentially a dead branch of a tree that just dropped to the ground. And Gillard, except for the manoeuvres in the last couple of days, I can hear Gerard kind of amping up to give me notes later saying, you're all wrong about this. It's okay. Don't mind a disagreement. So this happened, and what subsequently happened you're all aware of. Julia Gillard's Prime Ministership was a pretty patchy affair. She did manage to achieve the negotiation with the crossbenchers to form government, bettering Tony Abbott at that. She did run a remarkably effective parliament with Anthony Albanese's assistance as leader of the government in the House, who did a lot of the negotiations for her and with her to get bills through. She achieved a massive legislative agenda, including some major reforms. But she was being torn apart in this incredible kind of two-ended savagery where she had the Tony Abbott coalition opposition coming at her from this side and the Rudd allies inside caucus coming at her from the other. She was caught in this terrible pincer movement, and my book was going to land right in the middle of that minefield. The publisher, Allen and Unwin's publicity manager, said, look, we've got to do this launch at the press club. There's a feeding frenzy going on. People just want to eat your book. It was just crazed. And so I thought this was a pretty disturbing development. This is not who I was as a biographer. I was not someone who wanted to create material for people to use maliciously against a serving Prime Minister. It was not that I was a Labor person favouring Gillard. You've got to remember, there was a significant amount of caucus also gunning for Gillard. So there was plenty of scope to be a Labor person keen to get such a book out. But what I deeply felt was that to be a biographer is to accept a great responsibility, especially with a living subject. You've got to be accurate. You've got to be fair. But at the same time, you've got to deliver everything. You've got to do it with the necessary nuance. And you hope, and I think it's reasonable to expect a nuanced, thoughtful reaction, not some mad, crazed feeding frenzy, where things that in a normal political atmosphere, instead of a supercharged one, would have been matters for interest, discussion, reflection, debate, but not to be twisted and used to kill someone politically who, whatever their strengths and weaknesses, and we can debate that endlessly, did not deserve to be torn apart like by wild dogs in the Australian Parliament. She just didn't deserve it. So I thought, wow, I'm not going through with this. Spiked it, gave my advance back, and then resolutely never answered the question asked of me so many times, why didn't you publish that biography of Gillard? What? So many times. So in this book, I thought, that's how I'm going to start it. I'm going to explain that this book grew from my desire to find out whether there had been a political biographer before of a contemporary subject still in politics who had been in the same situation as me, who had to make those careful decisions about what to do with the book, whether to allow it to go forward, lest it be very profoundly misused. In short, to examine the question of political biography as political intervention. So I then set out, in effect, to do my second PhD on that topic. And to do that, I identified every biography written of an Australian 20th century Prime Minister, written in the lead up to or during their term of office. So not at all interested in biographies written after they've left office, only in the lead up to or during their term of office, to see how their careers were affected by it. So I had to identify the books, find out who the biographers were, work out their motivations, consider the motivations of the subjects, look at the dynamics between the subject and the author, between the biographer and the politician. What was going on in that exchange? These were very much the questions on my mind. And at the back of my mind was actually a comment, Gerard, made by someone you would have known back in the Parliament House days, back in the early 80s, who I won't name. But when I was writing my first biography of John Hewson when he was opposition leader, said, Chris, you know, you've got to be careful with this stuff. Biography is like a form of sorcery. That was, for the camera, that was Anne Henderson going, ha ha. You know it's true, right, Anne? Yeah, you know it's very true. So that is the genesis of the book, and very interesting and unexpected results. For those who have read it already, bear with me. For those who haven't, I'll just briefly explain the structure. So I start off in the first chapter, which I call Absent Fathers, looking at the first half dozen Australian Prime Ministers, Barton, Deakin, Watson, Reid, Cook and Fisher. And I call this chapter Absent Fathers because it's astonishing how little was written of about those first six Prime Ministers. In some cases, it was 100 years after their Prime Ministership that the first book got written. We have a national forgetting of these figures. I think there's a whole PhD thesis to be done just on the question of why that is. I won't go into it here. But so little written with such enormous effect. This is just a lacuna in our national consciousness. And some hardy journalists tried to fill it. People like Alfred Buchanan and Herbert Campbell-Jones were journalists in the press gallery when Parliament met in Melbourne for the first quarter century of its life. And they wrote contemporary sketches of those early Prime Ministers, kept their notes and subsequently tried to publish them, and no one was interested. It was just so sad. Their manuscripts are languishing in the National Library of Australia collection right now, and in fact when I get around to it I'd quite like to publish them now. But there was no interest in these manuscripts, and that was the first heads up I got, that the unsung heroes in this story are Australian journalists, because more often than not when you find a political biography written, it's usually someone who either is a journalist or has been a journalist, and there's very much a kind of a two sides of the coin thing happening here with journalists and historians. Journalists, of course, famously taking great pride in writing the first draft of history, and historians busily looking down their nose at journalists without journalists realising it, that they're only writing the first drafts of history, and then, of course, drawing heavily on those first drafts to write scholarly history. The second chapter, The Great War to the Great Depression, covers Hughes, Scullin and Lyons. And again, you know, there's been quite a lot of work on Hughes, and I cover some of that here. But Scullin and Lyons, scandalously neglected. I mean, good on you, Anne. 2 books on the Lyons family's politicians. I mean, if not you, who? There is a real gap even in that kind of interwar period, that depression period, which is just waiting for PhD students to come and really work over. It's ripe grounds for action. The third chapter is called Menzies' Biography Mystery, and this in the book is one of my very favourite chapters. Bob Menzies absolutely hated journalists, and he absolutely hated biography of living subjects. He despised it. But again, you know, we have this terrible conflation of history. We think back on Menzies and we think a legend, a titan, extraordinary politician. The truth is he was a failed politician, effectively lost the confidence of his own cabinet and had to depart as Prime Minister first time round, then remade himself. And even when he won the 1949 election, he was still tremendously unpopular, so unpopular that he was prompted to, against his better judgment, collaborate in the production of a draft biography with a journalist called Alan Dawes, who'd done work for the Liberal Party, who was kind of a friend of the party. He'd been press secretary for a few earlier Conservative government ministers. And this fascinating, I put this really quite incredible jigsaw puzzle together from, again, manuscript material in the National Library mostly, where the picture is of this journalist interviewing Menzies on tape, transcribing the tapes, writing up chapters, sending them to Menzies' office, where Lenny would then distribute them to Stuart Coburn, the press secretary, to Menzies' brother, to Menzies. It was this kind of collective effort to produce this Menzies biography, which never saw the light of day. And the question is why? And you have to read that chapter to find out. I'm not cluing you in, but it's a good story. Next chapter is World War II to the end of the Menzies line, and that covers, of course, Curtin, Chifley, Holt, Gorton, McMahon on either side of Menzies. Not pretty slim pickings there, except with Gorton, where Alan Trengove wrote a really interesting biography of Gorton after he became Prime Minister, in which he anticipated that thing we're so familiar with now, where politicians structure the injection of difficult aspects of their life into the public debate so that they can get it out structured their way rather than have their enemies structure it in a way that could hurt them. So a kind of inoculation by biography against political scandal. And Alan Trengove was the first person to do that in Australia. And he disclosed quite controversially for the Times Gorton's illegitimacy in a way that was sympathetic, factual and informed, not rabidly, manically terrible and slighting of Gorton. So that was important. Then chapter 5, the modern era begins. That's on Whitlam and Fraser. The Whitlam chapter, part of that chapter is really quite something because the books were so good. Laurie Oakes's quartet of books on Whitlam, one of which was written with David Solomon, then also a press gallery journalist as well as a kind of legal scholar. They're really an astonishingly good portrait of a politician emerging. Of course, we think we know Gough now, but Laurie started that project thinking Whitlam was such a conundrum and setting out to work out who he was, what was he about, who was this strange animal, so large, so eminent looking, so toffy, who was a Labor leader. It's a fantastic quartet of books. And of course, the other figure in the Whitlam biographical realm that's so important is Graham Freudenberg, Whitlam's great alter ego, his press set come political advisor come alter ego, so close that they could finish each other's sentences. And of course, Freudenberg writes a certain grandeur after the dismissal as Gough goes to his last election in 1972, and Freudenberg writes this incredibly poignant, accurate, and in such an intelligent book, in such unexpected ways. It's really a very fascinating period in political biography in the 20th century here. And then, of course, chapter 6, Bob Hawke writ large. Well, where do you start? That's, I don't care where you look in 20th century political biography. There's not a better story than Blanche Del Puget's book, Robert J. Hawke, and its role in reconstructing Hawke's own psyche and, in effect, getting him into race-worthy condition so he can actually knock off the grog and become Prime Minister and be an effective Prime Minister. It is a phenomenal story. And, of course, it was the third Hawke biography. There was already Robert Pullen's and John Hurst's of completely different complexion and importance. So the first one, John Hurst, is written very much from the kind of drinking mate perspective of Bob Hawke, you know, the kind of trades hall character, knockabout bloke kind of thing. Although there's a little hint at the end about the potential dangers for Hawke of his drinking. Then the Robert Pullen biography of Hawke, a fantastically solid journalistic job, ethical, excellent research. And this was a man, Robert Pullen, who held in his hands Hawke's career as he learnt that Hazel had had an abortion of twins so that Bob could take up his Rhodes Scholarship. Pullen knew that, but with being a journalistic craftsperson, would not write it unless he found a corroborating source, because of course that's how we were all trained as old school journalists. You find something out, but unless you find a corroborating source, you can't write it. Pullen didn't write it. Had he, Hawke, well, Australian political history would certainly be different. Blanche Del Puget also found out about it, but in deference to Hazel Hawke's privacy and preference that not be disclosed, she didn't write it either. Classic of the kind of ethical dilemma biographers face, how they deal with them, and the consequence for political history. And then finally, Polaroids of a Busy Life, where I cover Keating and Howard. I think you'd all be interested very much in that. And this is a kind of a feature of the prime ministers who were alive while I was doing this research. I made a point of tracking down and interviewing the biographers and their subjects in the case of each living Australian Prime Minister, so that we get that extra dimension of what's going on between them. And then finally I wrap up and draw a few conclusions about political biography as a political intervention. And Gerard, if you'll excuse me, I'll just read the very last paragraph of the book rather than paraphrase it, because I thought long and hard about how to put this. So this is the last paragraph of Political Lives. Reputation is political capital. Biographers are among those who coin it and who can destroy it, as well as providing the material for others to do the same for their own multifarious reasons. None of the biographers in Australia's first century of national politics faced the potential frenzy I faced with the Gillard project early in its second century. Pressing on would have constituted a political intervention of an unintended kind. Some will say not pressing on itself constituted a kind of political intervention, to which I would respond by asking whether contemporary political biography demands a variation on the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm, unless it's deserved and intentional. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So the copies of Chris Wallace's book, Political Lives, Australian Prime Ministers and Their Biographers, and they're on sale tonight, and I'm sure our speaker will be happy to sign them after the event. And they'll also sell online later on for those who are on Zoom or see this later on television or on film. So now we come to questions and discussion. Everyone's got to be brief and don't stand in front of the camera. So if you come back here, Chris, you made that point about your relationship with Julia Gillard that you mentioned at the front of the book, and then you conclude on it about how you didn't want to get caught up in a political fight about her. Going back to where you sort of ended on with Bob Hawke, I remember Milton Cockburn, the journalist, when he reviewed, after this, the Hawke, Blanche Del Puget's biography came out, and I think when a second edition came out, around that time, Milton Cockburn made the point that if we'd known about Blanche's relationship with Bob, there would have been a quite different interpretation of that book. So I know you cover it in your book, but she didn't reveal her relationship with Hawke until, well, she denied it for quite some time. She revealed it not so long ago, probably 10 years ago. But so do you think that was missing? I mean, how do you judge the ethics of that? Just
to take the first part of that, Gerard, I didn't have a relationship with Julia Gillard. we knew each other faintly, by passing in corridors or running into each other in airport lounges. I certainly was not a Gerard camp member or fellow traveller at all. I was interested in Gerard because, to me, it was clear she was going to be the first Australian woman Prime Minister, most likely. And I really liked her attitude to power. So many women in politics think, oh, power, icky. Not Gerard. She absolutely understood she had to get power, accumulate it and wield it. Now, the question is then what you do with it and to what ends and why. Okay, we'll just won't go into that with Gerard for now. But she would have preferred I didn't write a biography of her because she had Jacqueline Kent kind of quasi doing a friendly on the side, which was a very good book actually in the end. Well worth reading, but no relationship with Gerard. But as to your point about Del Puget, yeah, I think again it's a conflation of history problem in that a few things. First of all, when she actually did the biography, Blanche would say that she was not in a relationship with Bob. And the reason is she was actually in a substantive relationship with another man at the time that Bob didn't know about. The fact that they were having sex while researching the book was not a matter that Blanche felt was affecting the text. And when it ended, when the research and writing finished and the publication came out, Blanche left the country, right? So I think it's important to distinguish these things. I think some men maybe on Zoom would be familiar with the situation where you're not in a relationship with someone, but you're having sex with someone, and maybe some of the women too. So that's a thing in contemporary life, apparently, and even back then in the really old days. The other thing is the book wasn't actually well received in Canberra. People like Paul Keating thought the book was going to be the absolute end of Hawke's political aspirations because there was so much negative material in it. The press gallery was not impressed by Bob. They were pretty down on him. Bob never had the numbers in caucus to defeat Hayden. Instead, it was the psychological war they played against Hayden that caused Hayden to stand aside for him. So, again, this is why we need many more historians, PhD students working in this area because, folks, the details really matter.
It does give a new meaning to the concept of research. Now, where do we got a... There's a question down the back.
The cool guy with the striped jersey.
I feel I should...
You've got to talk into the microphone.
I feel as if I should... Let me pull out the hearing aid. Yes. I feel as I should say doctor, doctor, as the Germans would. Is there
Please.
a danger, with due respect to all biographers here, of a biographer being either, as they say, a sycophant or poisonous against the subject?
Utterly boring biographies are written by sycophants. Like, the minute you pick one up, it's drips with saccharin and you've just got to put it down. It's disgusting. Similarly, ones written by axe murderers who are out to destroy the reputation of the subject, utterly boring, unless you're pursuing them for research purposes. So, for example, the fourth Hawke biography or biographical work was by Stan Anson, who took Blanche's research and used a psychoanalytic frame to absolutely vivisect Hawke and really try and damage him. And this was happening as, of course, Paul Keating was pursuing the prime ministership. But, we know how to do it. The biographical prose, we know how to do it right. Give it everything, don't hold back, but be ethical, be nuanced. If anyone is genuinely deeply interested in biography and wants to take it beyond my book, which is fantastic, by the way, this is a really terrific book just published by Routledge by the Australian Dictionary of Biographies General Editor, Professor Melanie Nolan, called Biography and Historiography. Shocking title, right? Makes you want to go to sleep. But it is world-beating. Like, I would say this is by far the best book on biography ever written in English in the modern or contemporary era, and really well worth reading and addresses questions like yours.
Just before we go, that reference you made to the book, Anson wasn't who took all the material, most of the material from Blanche Del Puget. That's, you refer to in your book, but that's the Melbourne University political science part of it, isn't it? That
Yeah.
group that just like Graham Little and all.
That's
Tell
right.
us about that
Melbourne
group.
Psychosocial Group. So that's kind of a lost thing in the Australian Academy, sadly, except as was pointed out in the ABR review of my book, individual academics from that group, the Melbourne Psychosocial Group, continued writing from that perspective after the group kind of fell apart. It was built around Fu Davis and Graham Little at Melbourne University. They were political scientists. And as political science rushed in a metricised direction, this group held on stoutly to the importance of psychology in politics and especially the importance of political biography. And yes, Stan Anson did his masters at Melbourne University, supervised by, I think, Graham Little. And that was, I'm very sad about the Anson Hawke book because it kind of killed off the enthusiasm that had been building to pursue more psychological analyses of leaders in Australia. I think if you look at the last several prime ministers we've had, more urgent than ever.
Yeah, a question about the forgotten fathers. Do you think that the absence of curiosity about them was perhaps traceable to the fact that at that time Australians really had a duality of citizenship? One was Australian, the other was British. And the big game was in London, not in Australia. So what happened here, despite the way we may now look at it in many respects, was sort of just a couple of levels above the local council.
That's really interesting. I'd say two things to that. The first is I think that's less rather than more likely because of the incredible fervour and motivation on the ground that was necessary to make federation happen. So I think at the time there was tremendous pride in forming the federation and a lot of public activism about it, which you'd think would make it more likely they'd write these books. I think part of the problem is we took our political culture early nationally, took its cue from Britain. And there is also a great lack of political biography in Britain at that time, in contrast to the US, where campaign biographies had existed pretty much since Washington. But, you know, Salisbury, who was British Prime Minister at the turn of the 20th century, famously boasted that in his entire career, and that was his third time as Prime Minister, he'd never given an interview to a journalist once, right? So different political culture. And in fact, our first political biography contemporarily published was of Billy Hughes. There were two of them. It was in World War II, published in Britain for British political purposes, and the Australian market was just an afterthought. But I think one more important element here. I think there's a lot we want to forget about that early Federation period. You can't go and read the Hansards without being absolutely shocked and appalled by the unity across the Parliament from all parties about white Australia. So people, for example, like to cling to Deakin as a, you know, civilised, exciting, progressive kind of centre-right person, you know, incredibly racist. You can't kind of read it and not go, oh my God. And you can come up with rationalisations, but they're not pretty. So I think the absent fathers phenomenon is something that's on our national homework to address, and we've really got to get around to.
I got one on Zoom, then we go over here. So Dennis O'Day from Canberra. Did Menzies ever warm to the media, especially in his later term in office?
No, he thought they were scum. He just could not bear them. There's a great anecdote in the book, honestly, truly. If you like politics, incredibly good stories here. One of them is that early on, when Menzies is Prime Minister the second time around, the party is actually worried that his press relations with the press gallery is so bad that they've really got to get a good press sec in to sort it out. Menzies resists vigorously. Finally, he succumbs because his polling is terrible at this stage. The Cold War hadn't kind of caused it to rev up yet. His skillful use of the Cold War, that is. And so the party and his office and kind of friends were madly rifling through lists of journalists' names and approaching people. Every single one of them said no, often because they did not think he could win the next election. That's how poor his standing was. And finally someone said, what about, it might have even been Menzies, I'll have to check my own book on this. Someone said, what about that bloke you met in London that you quite thought was okay? And it was Stuart Cockburn. And he came on board and was his long serving press secretary, did a very good job as Menzies press secretary. And it must have been a very hard job given Menzies' attitude, not only to journalists but to proprietors too.
Sorry, I'm interested. Assuming that the racist attitudes of all the prime ministers were actually sort of held by most of the people who might have written the biographies, if you follow my meaning, I'm also wondering whether it was about the fact that there wasn't actually a huge publishing industry in Australia until the 1930s, and that everybody was being published by British publishers. So I wonder if that is really sort of economic, as it were, who are we going to sell it to, who cares, sort of idea, which is why, of course, Hughes, who was a figure in European politics, however eccentric, was where you would publish him. But,
Thanks, Judith. This is Judith Pugh, herself a very excellent biographer and memoirist. Thanks for coming tonight, Judith. Yes. Look, that is definitely a factor, and I mentioned this. It's really, you mentioned the 30s. It's really not until the late 60s, and especially in the 70s with the election of Whitlam, who pumped money into, making the nascent industry thrive. That's definitely a factor. But there's definitely more to it. You can't have the first 6 prime ministers being pretty much a blank, except for Deakin, and then only from a selective perspective, without something else going on. I think it's really interesting fields to plumb there.
Hello, I'm interested in your comment or opinion about reporters and biographers being players as opposed to reporters and spectators. You mentioned in your book Alan Reid wanted to be a player, as opposed to, say, Laurie Oakes, who was a reporter and an observer. And Alan Reid, his last couple of books was a particularly scathing biography of Gorton called The Gorton Experiment, I suppose inspired by the Ainsley Gotto issue, and then the Whitlam venture with a very aggressive photo of Gough Whitlam on the cover, almost snarling at the audience and camera, and they were both aggressive. He seemed to be a real player, along with Michael Schulberger at the time. Wondered what your opinion is of players.
Your characterisation of Alan Reid is absolutely spot on. He was a player. I don't think most journalists were or are, and I think it's, unless you've been in the profession, it's not appreciated that you can be professional and personal and not have the two mix up. And to, give you an analogy, Bob Menzies once had a brief for the Builders Labourers Federation in court, right? He would have conducted that with great professionalism. You can be a reporter and believe, like Alan Reid, that, Labor was dire and they should never be in office. But he made the sin of letting that contaminate his professional output. And I think that's a great pity. On the other hand, one of the great quotes in the book is Alan Reid making a killer point about journalists versus proprietors. And he writes that journalists are merely the foot soldiers of the proprietor. If Alan Reid's proprietor had thought Labor was great and they should have got in, Alan Reid would have known he couldn't have written what he did. It was because his views aligned with the proprietor. So, fascinating historical figure. We need a really great biography of Alan Reid. Thanks for reminding me of that.
Thanks, Chris. It's fascinating stuff. I'm interested in how biography emerges. So much of what you're talking about is where the writer, the historian, the journalist, whoever, is in physical contact with the subject. Whereas if you go back and you do something on someone who's long dead, are you going to be more objective, or are you going to lose things because you're not there? And I find journalists have a particular understanding of the politicians or prime ministers they work with because they actually see them in the flesh. Now that must be of help, but also must colour their judgment. So how do you get the best out of the both? I mean, I can see where personal animosities or personal hagiography could come in, or I can see where someone who's a bit more dispassionate and outside might miss something, but they might get a more accurate touch.
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the reasons this book was not published faster was I couldn't let go of the first chapter of my PhD thesis, which was about such questions. So I looked at systematically what were the ethical and practical dilemmas of a biographer doing a dead subject versus a live subject, and one doing if you're doing a live subject, one who was a politician or not a politician, how it affected sources, perspective, and so on. In fact, I really should turn that into a journal article. The truth is, you can be dispassionate and nuanced and sophisticated in your approach, whether they're dead or alive. I mean, I know historians, I've read historians' work, where they've fallen madly in love with a dead figure, archive fever, completely unhinged and unbalanced. And I've read completely disinterested in the true sense of that word, objective, fair, excellent perspective of live subjects. It's inherent in the author to do it their way, however that way is. Myself, in terms of dead or alive, I just see alive as giving you more data. And whether the subject's dead or alive, I'm always very careful, don't fall in love with your subject. Not least because it makes for a terrible biography.
Just on the behaviour of the gallery and that, I remember seeing an old film of Robert Menzies and all the gallery sitting down. You came in the room and they all suddenly stood up as a matter of respect.
God,
so it shows how things have changed. But I'm still recovering from last Wednesday's talk on the ABC. I just haven't got over it yet. But I think the difference in a lot of the journalists, Dave McNichol goes back a long way, Peter Bowers, even Alan Reid, I found those people very intelligent and very experienced in the world, and I think that's made a big difference. And I really have my doubts about a lot of journalists now. They're more opinion people rather than journalists.
Well, Peter Bowers is a great example. This is, for those who watch Insiders, this is the father of Michael Bowers, who does Talking Pictures. To me, Peter Bowers was superbly professional, but with his critical faculties engaged. He could kind of infuse objective political journalism with humanity and feeling and judgment that is a distinct thing from bias. I think you're right, what we see too often now is just straight out bias, I'm for that side or that side, and I think that's a very bad thing. I think the old, call me crazy, but I love the old-fashioned distinction between reporting and comment, and I wish especially on television we saw a clearer distinction. And it's not a matter of analysing the tone even sometimes. The tone can be quite professional, but you listen and analyse the questions and you think, that's just not right.
We're getting to the end, so just finally, the reaction to your book. Now, a lot of the people in your book, we used to say are dead, we now say they've passed. We're not quite sure where to.
I like dead. I think Hemingway-esque directness is a great thing.
I like dead, yeah. So
if we're going with dead.
Some of the leaders, prime ministers are dead, some of the journalists are dead, but of the living ones, what sort of response have you had from both those living authors and the living prime ministers, any at all?
I've had an absolutely fantastic response, not least because political history is out of fashion, and what this book really is underneath is another way of writing a history of 20th century Australian politics through prime ministers and their biographers. And I've not struck a single one that hasn't gone, I just can't believe that story about X, right? They are starved of information, of historical knowledge and perspective of their own business. I should put together a website and put all the reviews and related material up about this book. One of them is Treasurer Jim Chalmers' extraordinarily good speech on launching the book at my home institution, the University of Canberra. He wrote every word himself. He is himself a writer. No, they've absolutely loved it, Gerard, and many journalists too, because not enough political history that people want to read because it's not deadly dull and dry and boring and or irrelevant or obscure is being written. We need a big rush back to political history, in political science. I don't care where it comes from. Many more PhD students. This is really important because we cannot work well as a nation unless we know our own political history and our leaders well.
That's a very good point to end on. So, many thanks. So thanks for a great night tonight to Chris Wallace. An important book, and it has been very well received, and it's a very interesting read, and it's not like a PhD thesis, or most of the PhD thesis. It's actually readable, which I think brings in the journalistic background as well. I said, yeah, but it could be unreadable. That'd be a lot worse. No, well, I probably should have said it's a great read rather than great read. God, we're being pedantic tonight. I'm trying to praise the book. Anyway, it's a great speech, great book. Copies will be on sale here tonight and online. We'll love to have you back when you've got another project. A few hints tonight, but we'll see. Well done.